The office was quiet except for the sound of a keyboard clicking and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Sarah sat at her desk, eyes focused on the computer screen as she meticulously typed away at the report. The fluorescent lighting above flickered, creating an almost surreal atmosphere as the deadline loomed closer. She could feel the tension in the air, the pressure mounting with every second. Her mind raced, trying to catch up with the work that seemed to pile up endlessly. "Sarah," a voice cut through the stillness of the office. It was Mr. Turner, her boss. His voice always had a way of making the air feel heavier. Sarah looked up from her desk, meeting his cold gaze. Mr. Turner, a man in his mid-40s, with a meticulously combed hairstyle and a tailored suit, stood in the doorway of her cubicle. His eyes, usually sharp with judgment, narrowed as he stared at her. "Can I speak to you for a moment?" he said, his tone authoritative, but laced with an undercurrent of something else, disapproval, perhaps. Sarah stood, her stomach turning slightly. She knew what this was about. It had been coming for days. She had been late to work once again, the traffic unpredictable, and the late-night shift at her second job had made it harder to juggle everything. But no matter how much she worked, no matter how much she contributed to the company, it seemed like nothing was ever good enough for him. "I've had enough of your excuses, Sarah," Mr. Turner said, his tone icy. "Your lateness is becoming a problem, and frankly, it's unacceptable. This is a professional environment, and if you can't handle the basics, you don't belong here." Sarah felt the familiar sting of his words, but she swallowed the lump in her throat. She had worked hard for this position, she had given everything to this company. She didn't have time for his games anymore. Not after all these years. "I understand, Mr. Turner," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady, though her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "But the traffic has been bad lately. And I've been working 2 jobs too." He interrupted her, his voice growing colder. "No more excuses, Sarah. I've warned you before. If this happens again, there will be consequences. And quite frankly, I'm tired of waiting. I'm firing you effective immediately." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, staring at her boss, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You can't be serious," she said, the disbelief evident in her voice. Mr. Turner didn't flinch. "I am. You're fired, Sarah. Don't bother coming back." 10 years later, the room was filled with the sound of low murmurs as the employees of Turner Enterprises sat at their desks, awaiting the CEO's announcement. It had been a long time since Sarah had been in the office, but today she was returning, this time, not as the underdog but as the woman who had built her own empire. Sarah entered the boardroom with a confidence that was worlds apart from the young woman she had once been, the one who had been fired for being late, humiliated and dismissed by the very man who had once held her future in his hands. But now, 10 years later, Sarah stood before them as the new CEO of Turner Enterprises. She had fought her way up from the bottom, built her own reputation, and turned her own company into a global powerhouse. As the board members and employees looked on, Sarah smiled, a calm, collected smile that reflected the strength and resilience she had gained over the years. She could see the shock in their faces, some familiar, some new. They knew the story, they had heard the rumors. And they knew that today she was the one in charge. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah said, her voice confident and commanding. "I'm pleased to be standing before you today as the new CEO of Turner Enterprises. I know this company has a storied history, but as we look to the future, we must evolve. We must change. And that's exactly what we're going to do." She paused, letting her words settle in. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Sarah could feel the weight of their gaze on her, but she wasn't intimidated. She had worked too hard, fought too long for this moment to let anyone think they could diminish her accomplishments. But there was one person in that room who wasn't looking at her with admiration or awe. It was Mr. Turner, now sitting at the far end of the table, his once powerful demeanor now diminished. He hadn't expected this. No one had. As Sarah's eyes met his, she saw the recognition in his expression, both surprise and something else, something that hinted at the guilt he had carried with him all these years. But there was no sympathy in Sarah's heart for him. Not anymore. She cleared her throat and continued, her voice steady. I know some of you might wonder about my connection to this company, considering my history with Mr. Turner, she said, making sure to emphasize the name with precision. But I'm here today not to dwell on the past. We're here to look forward. She let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. I was once the woman who was fired for something as trivial as being late to work. I was dismissed, discarded, because of a mistake I made. But what Mr. Turner and many others failed to see was that that mistake didn't define me. It was the beginning of my journey, not the end. And 10 years later, I stand before you as the CEO of a company that I built from the ground up. The boardroom was silent, the weight of her words settling on everyone. Sarah could see some of the younger employees nodding, inspired by her resilience. Others, especially the older ones, looked uncomfortable, perhaps even embarrassed by the truth that Sarah had just laid bare. Mr. Turner, his face pale, shifted in his seat. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah raised a hand, stopping him before he could utter a single word. "I'm not here for apologies," she said coldly, her gaze fixed on him. "I'm here because I earned my place. And today, this company is mine." As Sarah left the boardroom, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues following her every step. But unlike the woman she had once been, unsure of herself and out of place in a world that had dismissed her, Sarah walked with purpose. She was no longer defined by the mistakes of her past. She was defined by her strength, by her determination to prove to herself, and to the world, that she was more than capable. Outside the building, as she took a moment to look at the city skyline, she knew one thing for certain: nothing was impossible, not when you had the will to fight for what you deserved. And as Sarah turned to enter her new office as the CEO, she felt the weight of everything she had worked for, every obstacle she had overcome, falling away behind her. Sarah walked into the office, the doors swinging open to reveal her new domain. The sleek glass walls and modern decor of the space gave it an air of authority, but for Sarah, it felt more like a reflection of the long journey she had traveled. Every inch of the office, from the polished hardwood floors to the expansive windows overlooking the city, felt earned. She moved toward the large mahogany desk that was now hers, and as she sat down in the high-backed chair, a sense of quiet pride filled her. She had done it. She had made it here on her own terms. No longer the victim of circumstances, no longer dismissed as just a woman who had been late to work, but as a force to be reckoned with. The room buzzed with activity as her new team filtered in, each of them respectful, but Sarah could sense the uncertainty in their eyes. They knew her story, and they knew the company's history. Sarah had been the underdog, and now she was in charge. The power dynamic had shifted, and some of them were still processing what that meant for their future. One by one, her team members filed in, each person offering a polite nod or handshake. Sarah made sure to remember each name, to recognize their roles in the company. These were her new colleagues, her new allies. They were the ones who would help shape the company under her leadership. She wasn't just there to take the seat of power, she was there to change the way the company operated, to challenge the toxic culture that had once held it back. But despite the respect she received from her team, there was one person she could feel lingering in the background: Mr. Turner. His face was still etched in her memory, his arrogant eyes that had once looked down on her with disdain. His presence in the room was a reminder of her past, but she was determined not to let it control her future. He might still have his seat on the board, but Sarah knew that power was fleeting. His time was over. It was hers now. A few days later, Sarah called a meeting with the board of directors. She had already met with her leadership team, discussing strategies and goals for the future, but this was different. The board, filled with old men who had long held their positions through tradition and not innovation, would be her biggest challenge. These were the men who had seen her rise from the very bottom, and they were the ones who would be most reluctant to accept her as the new CEO. As she entered the boardroom, she felt their eyes on her. Mr. Turner sat at the far end of the long table, his expression stiff and unreadable. Sarah's gaze met his for a moment, and for the briefest of seconds, she saw the flicker of something in his eyes: regret, perhaps, or maybe fear. But whatever it was, she couldn't afford to focus on it. Not now. "Thank you for joining me today," Sarah began, her voice steady but commanding. "I've spent the past few days reviewing the company's current position and its future potential. I know there are some concerns about my leadership, given my history with Turner Enterprises. But I'm here to show you that I am not the same woman I was 10 years ago." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. The board members shifted, uncomfortable, but Sarah pressed on. She wasn't here to beg for their approval, she was here to demand their respect. "We've reached a critical juncture in this company's history," Sarah continued. "We need to adapt. We need to evolve. And I will not allow the outdated practices that have held us back to continue. We've been stuck in a cycle of stagnation for too long. It's time for change. It's time for progress." Mr. Turner shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah raised a hand, silencing him before he could get a word out. "I've heard enough from you, Mr. Turner," she said coolly. "You've had your time. And while I'm sure you have a wealth of experience, I'm the one who has earned the right to lead this company now. You had your chance to grow this company into something meaningful, but you chose to hold it back. I won't do that. I'm here to move us forward." The room was silent. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They had always been loyal to Mr. Turner, but now they were faced with something they hadn't expected. Sarah, the woman they had once cast aside, standing before them, commanding the room with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "Sarah," Mr. Turner finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "I understand you have big plans, but the company is not a playground for your personal ambitions. There are things that need to be maintained, traditions that need to be respected." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she turned to face him. "Traditions?" she said, her voice sharp. "What traditions, Mr. Turner? The tradition of mediocrity? The tradition of fear and control? It's time for new traditions. It's time for innovation. We're going to build something that lasts, something that leads. And I intend to do that with or without your approval." The boardroom was still. The tension in the air was palpable as Sarah's words sank in. No one had dared to speak to Mr. Turner like that in years. He had been the face of the company for decades, and now this woman, the very woman he had fired for being late, was standing up to him, taking control. Later that evening, Sarah sat alone in her office, the weight of the meeting still fresh on her mind. The board hadn't fully accepted her yet, but they knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to back down. She had proven that. But there was still much work to be done. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. The phone rang twice before the voice on the other end picked up. "Hello," a familiar voice answered. "Mr. Turner," Sarah said, her voice steady, though her heart raced slightly. "I'm sure you know by now that I've taken over the company. But I wanted to say this directly to you: you're out. This is my company now. And I'm not going to let you destroy it the way you did before." There was a long pause before Mr. Turner spoke. His voice was hoarse. "You think you can just take over like this? You think you can erase everything I built?" Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "No, Mr. Turner. I'm not erasing anything. But I will make sure the company moves forward, whether you like it or not." The silence on the other end was deafening. The next few months were filled with challenges, but Sarah had the clarity and determination to push through. Slowly, the board began to accept her leadership, and the changes she had promised started to take shape. Employees who had once felt stifled by Mr. Turner's oppressive rule found new hope under Sarah's leadership. The company began to thrive in ways it hadn't in years, and with each small victory, Sarah's confidence grew. She knew her battle wasn't over, but with each step she took, she was carving out a future that was hers to define. The woman who had once been dismissed for being late was now leading the company into a new era, and no one, not even Mr. Turner, could take that away from her. Months passed, and Sarah's leadership of Turner Enterprises began to reshape the company. The transition wasn't without its obstacles, but with every decision she made, she proved that her time had come. Her vision was clear. She was building a company that prioritized innovation, diversity, and sustainability. The changes she made started to pay off. Profits were up, employees were engaged, and the company culture was shifting. But there was still a lingering presence in the back of her mind, the one person who had once stood in her way, and now, as a shadow in the boardroom, Mr. Turner. Despite his public absence, Sarah knew he wasn't going to fade into the background easily. His influence ran deep, especially with some of the long-standing board members who still held on to outdated ideals. Though he was no longer in the CEO chair, Turner's name still carried weight, and there were whispers, those who doubted Sarah's ability to lead a company that had been his legacy. And for every supporter she gained, there was still someone waiting for her to fail. One afternoon, Sarah sat in her office overlooking the city, her desk neatly organized with reports and strategies for upcoming initiatives. But as much as she tried to focus, her mind kept wandering to a meeting scheduled for later that day. It was with the board, a critical moment where she would present a new direction for the company, a plan to diversify Turner Enterprises even further and make them leaders in the tech and renewable energy sectors. She had prepared for months, meticulously mapping out every detail. Yet, there was always that small gnawing doubt in her stomach, the fear of being undermined, of her decisions being questioned not because they weren't solid, but because she was still a woman in a male-dominated space. She had faced that bias before, and though she had risen above it, it still lingered in some corners of the business world. The door to her office opened, and her assistant, Claire, stepped in with a clipboard in hand. "Sarah, the meeting with the board is in 10 minutes. Are you ready?" Sarah took a deep breath, pushed aside her worries, and stood. "As ready as I'll ever be. Let's do this." The boardroom was quiet as Sarah entered, her steps measured and confident. The board members sat around the polished table, and Mr. Turner was present as well, though his posture was noticeably more rigid than before. He sat in the far corner, his arms folded tightly in front of him. He was watching her closely, as though waiting for her to falter. But Sarah had come a long way from the woman he had fired for being late. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice calm yet commanding. "Today, I'm here to discuss our company's future, and I believe it's time for us to take bold steps into new industries that will drive Turner Enterprises to the forefront of global business." She placed a thick folder of plans on the table, each page filled with projections and data that detailed her strategy for expansion into tech and renewable energy. As she spoke, Sarah could feel the eyes of the board on her. Some of them were skeptical, others intrigued. Mr. Turner's eyes, however, were cold, his gaze unwavering as he analyzed every word she said. "We have the potential to lead in these industries," she continued. "We have the technology, the people, and the resources. All we need now is the commitment to embrace change and lead the charge." As she finished, Sarah glanced at each of the board members. She could see the hesitation in some, the uncertainty in others. But it was Mr. Turner who spoke first, his voice harsh and dismissive. "You want to change the core of this company?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. "We've built this company on manufacturing, on the things we know. Moving into tech and energy, it's risky, untested. We should stick with what's made us successful." Sarah's eyes didn't waver as she looked at him, her resolve firm. "With all due respect, Mr. Turner, that's exactly the mindset that's been holding us back. We can't be afraid to take risks. That's how you build the future." The board members glanced at each other, murmurs spreading. Sarah could sense the division in the room. Some were still clinging to the old ways, to the safety of the known. Others, however, looked intrigued, willing to entertain the idea that maybe, just maybe, Sarah's vision could lead them to new heights. Mr. Turner's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "I don't believe this is the right move," he said. "We should stick with what works, not gamble with our future." But Sarah wasn't done. She had anticipated this resistance. "I know this isn't easy, but change never is. If we don't evolve, we'll be left behind. And I'm not willing to let this company fade into irrelevance." For a moment, the room was silent. The tension was palpable. Then, one by one, a few board members spoke up, expressing their support for Sarah's vision. Some were hesitant, but Sarah could feel their conviction growing with every word. Finally, the deciding vote came. The board voted to approve her proposal to diversify the company. It was a close call, but Sarah had done it. The plan was set into motion. Later that evening, after the meeting had ended and the board members had filed out, Sarah found herself alone in her office. She leaned back in her chair, a sense of relief washing over her. The approval wasn't just a professional victory, it was a personal one. It was proof that her leadership, her vision, and her resilience had won over those who had once doubted her. Even Mr. Turner. She had faced down the ghosts of her past, the man who had fired her, the people who had undermined her, and come out on top. Sarah was no longer the woman who had been dismissed for something as trivial as being late. She was the woman who was leading a company into a new era, proving that no matter what obstacles she faced, she would always rise. The phone on her desk rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Claire, her assistant. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you." "It's Mr. Turner." A smile tugged at the corner of Sarah's mouth. She had been expecting this. "Send him in." Mr. Turner stepped into her office, his face stoic, but there was a hint of something else in his eyes. Reluctance, perhaps, or maybe even a grudging respect. He didn't sit, but instead stood by the door, his hands folded in front of him. "I have to admit," he began, his voice low, "I didn't think you could pull it off." Sarah stood, walking around her desk to face him. She looked him in the eye. "And yet, here we are." For a moment, there was a tense silence between them. Then Mr. Turner sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You were right," he said, his voice heavy with something close to defeat. "I was wrong about you, and I can't deny that you've made something of yourself. Something more than I ever thought possible." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step back and gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Take a seat, Mr. Turner. This company is going to need all hands on deck. I may be the CEO now, but the door is always open for those willing to adapt." Mr. Turner hesitated for a moment, then sat down. The power dynamic had shifted, but for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of the room shift as well. She had won, not just the battle for the CEO role, but the battle for her own future. The future of Turner Enterprises was hers to shape, and with every challenge, every doubt, she knew one thing for certain: she had earned it. Every step, every struggle had brought her here, and she was ready for whatever came next. The months following the board meeting marked a turning point in both Sarah's personal journey and the trajectory of Turner Enterprises. With the approval of her plan to diversify into tech and renewable energy, Sarah had proven that her vision for the future was not just viable, it was necessary. Turner Enterprises was transforming from a traditional company into an innovator, and Sarah was leading the charge. However, despite the successes, the road ahead was far from smooth. Old systems were slow to adapt, and there were still whispers among some of the older employees and stakeholders about the changes Sarah was pushing for. She was often faced with resistance, not only from within the company but from outside competitors who saw her rise as a challenge to their established control in the industry. But Sarah wasn't someone to back down. She knew that the real work was just beginning. One day, as Sarah sat in her office reviewing a new partnership proposal with a green energy startup, her assistant Claire entered with a message. "Sarah, Mr. Turner is here again. He insists on speaking with you," Claire said, her tone a mixture of curiosity and caution. "He seems different this time." Sarah's eyebrows furrowed. She had expected Turner to make an occasional appearance, but his recent visits had been few and far between. He hadn't fully stepped into his new role as a board member, and Sarah didn't push him to. She had no interest in rehashing the past, and she was focused on the future. "Send him in," Sarah said, setting aside the documents on her desk. She was ready for whatever he had to say. It was time to put all the lingering tensions behind them. Mr. Turner entered, his posture more subdued than usual. He wore a dark suit, but there was a weariness in his eyes that Sarah hadn't seen before. He stood at the door for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back as if unsure of how to approach her. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice measured. "I know we've had our differences. And I know I've been a difficult presence around here, especially since you took over. But I wanted to come here today to say, I was wrong." Sarah blinked in surprise. "About what?" she asked, leaning forward in her chair, intrigued but cautious. "About you," Turner said, his gaze not meeting hers as he spoke. "About your ability to lead this company. I see what you've done. You've turned Turner Enterprises into something unrecognizable. And I have to admit, I underestimated you." For a brief moment, Sarah didn't know how to respond. It wasn't an apology, but it was as close to one as she would ever get from him. She wasn't sure if she wanted to accept it, but she knew that she had fought for her position, fought for her worth, since the day he had fired her. She had nothing to prove to him anymore. "Thank you for acknowledging that," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "But it's not just about me, Mr. Turner. It's about the company. And if we're going to move forward, we need to work together." Turner nodded, his expression softening. "That's what I wanted to talk about. I've been thinking a lot about where I fit in now. I know my time as CEO is over, but I want to help. I want to be part of this transition, in whatever way I can." Sarah considered his words carefully. Turner was offering to help, but she was still cautious. Trust had to be earned, especially with someone who had once dismissed her so easily. But she knew that her leadership was about more than just proving herself. It was about building a stronger team, one that could adapt and grow together. And if Turner truly wanted to make amends, perhaps there was room for him. "We'll have to make some changes in the way we work," Sarah said slowly, her mind racing through the possibilities. "But if you're serious about being part of this company's future, we can find a way to collaborate. I won't forget the past, but I'm willing to look ahead." Turner nodded, his eyes meeting hers at last. "I understand. And I'm ready to prove it." The next few months saw a subtle but important shift in the dynamics of Turner Enterprises. With Sarah at the helm, the company expanded its influence in the renewable energy sector, securing key partnerships and pushing the boundaries of innovation. Sarah's decisions were bold, but they were also informed by her experience. She had been in the trenches, had fought for every opportunity, and now she was building something sustainable and future-focused. Turner, for his part, stepped into his new role as a board member, offering his experience in certain areas, but he no longer tried to impose his outdated views on the company. The respect between him and Sarah grew slowly, each learning to navigate the delicate balance of power and collaboration. One late evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with stakeholders, Sarah sat alone in her office, reviewing financial reports. The office was quiet, the city lights below casting a soft glow through the windows. It had been a long day, and she could feel the weight of her responsibilities pressing on her. She had come so far, but the road ahead was still full of challenges. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes briefly closing as she took a moment to reflect. She thought back to the day she had been fired, the sting of Mr. Turner's dismissal still fresh in her memory. And now, here she was, CEO of Turner Enterprises, leading a company into a new era. She had proven herself, not just to him, but to the world. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to smile. The journey had been long, but she had fought for every step. She had turned her failure into fuel for success, and nothing, no one, could take that away from her. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Claire, her assistant. "There's a special visitor at the front gate. Says it's someone important for your next project?" Sarah frowned, puzzled, but typed back, "Send them up." A few moments later, the door to her office opened, and Claire stepped in with a familiar figure in tow, an investor from the renewable energy sector Sarah had been courting for months. But what caught her off guard was the man standing behind him. Mr. Turner, a soft smile on his face. "Sarah," he said, his voice warm for the first time in a long while. "I thought I'd come by to give you something you've earned." Sarah stood, both surprised and curious. "What is it?" she asked. Mr. Turner handed her a small envelope. "This is the final vote of confidence I've been holding on to. I'm officially endorsing you. No strings attached." Sarah took the envelope from him, her heart racing. This was it, the gesture that would solidify her place, not just as CEO, but as the one in charge. With a smile, she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, a formal statement of endorsement, signed by the board. Mr. Turner had done it. He had finally given her what she needed, not just to lead the company, but to prove to herself that everything she had achieved was real. "I didn't do it for you, Sarah," Turner said, his voice quiet, almost sheepish. "I did it for the company. And for you, because you've earned it." Sarah stood tall, a sense of pride filling her. "Thank you," she said softly, the weight of the years of struggle and the victories now finally beginning to sink in. She had made it. Not just as a leader, but as a woman who had risen from the ashes of rejection and had created something lasting, something that would live on long after any of them were gone. As Sarah turned back to her desk, she knew one thing was certain: her journey had only just begun. The days that followed Sarah's endorsement were filled with a mix of exhilaration and uncertainty. Having secured the trust of the board, including Mr. Turner, Sarah's position as CEO was now firmly entrenched. But the challenges of leading a company in the midst of rapid change were far from over. The renewable energy sector was volatile, and while Sarah had already made substantial progress, there were plenty of hurdles to overcome. Her evenings were spent in meetings with investors, board members, and her executive team, each conversation pushing her closer to her ultimate goal: transforming Turner Enterprises into an industry leader in renewable energy and tech. She had always known the road would be difficult, but she was driven now more than ever. One late afternoon, Sarah sat in her office, reviewing a report on the progress of Turner's renewable energy projects. The city skyline outside her window was bathed in the warm orange glow of the setting sun. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment to gather her thoughts. Her mind was constantly moving, always thinking about the next steps, the next challenges. But this time, as she stared at the numbers on the page, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a knock at the door, pulling her from her thoughts. Claire, her assistant, stepped in, a concerned look on her face. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you," Claire said, holding up a visitor's card. "It's from an old acquaintance of yours, actually, one of your previous colleagues." "He says it's urgent?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially not someone from her past. "Send him in." Moments later, a tall, confident man walked through the door. It was Tom, an old colleague from her days at Turner Enterprises, someone who had worked with her when she was just starting out. She hadn't seen him in years. "Tom?" Sarah said, rising from her chair. "What are you doing here? Last time I checked, you left the company for a different opportunity." Tom's smile was tight, but there was an urgency in his eyes. I know. It's been a while, Sarah, but I need to talk to you. This isn't something I can just send in an email. It's about Turner Enterprises." Sarah's expression hardened. "What about it?" Tom walked toward her desk, taking a seat before speaking again, his tone serious. "I've been following what you've been doing with the company, and I have to say, it's impressive. You're making strides, but you need to be careful. There's a growing resistance, especially from the investors who are pushing for short-term returns. They don't care about the future of renewable energy. They care about profits. And you might be heading into dangerous territory." Sarah's pulse quickened. She knew that there would always be a push and pull between growth and profitability, but hearing it from Tom, someone who had been in the trenches with her all those years ago, added weight to his words. "I've been fighting that battle since I took over," Sarah replied, her voice steady but filled with concern. "I know how hard it is to shift focus when you're dealing with investors and stakeholders who are used to the status quo. But this is bigger than just making money. We have to do what's right, not just what's profitable in the short term." Tom nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes. "You're right. But I'm telling you, the pressure is mounting. And there's something else. Some of the major investors are looking to pull their support. They think you're taking too much of a risk with the renewable energy projects. They might try to push you out. They're already looking for a reason to replace you, Sarah." Sarah felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had known that resistance was inevitable, but to hear it confirmed so directly left her unsettled. The fight wasn't just against the internal struggles of her company anymore. It was against the system that had kept the old guard in power for so long. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said, her voice resolute. "I'm building a future, and I won't let anyone sabotage that. I'll do whatever it takes." Tom leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "Just be careful, Sarah. I'm telling you this because I care. I saw what happened with Turner. I saw how he let greed and ego drive everything. Don't let that happen to you." The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and more paperwork than Sarah cared to deal with. She couldn't shake Tom's warning, and as she dug deeper into the financials and investor reports, she began to see the cracks that Tom had mentioned. Certain stakeholders, those who had always preferred the status quo, were starting to push back more aggressively against the direction she was taking. The pressure was building. But Sarah didn't let the fear consume her. Instead, she made a decision. She was going to take control, just as she had always done. She called an emergency board meeting with her leadership team, determined to confront the challenges head-on. As she entered the conference room, the tension was palpable. The board members sat in their usual spots, and though some greeted her with nods, others remained silent. Mr. Turner was absent, but Sarah knew his influence still loomed large over the room. He had his allies, and she would need to navigate this carefully. "Thank you for joining on short notice," Sarah began, her voice calm but firm. "We have to discuss where Turner Enterprises is heading, and I won't sugarcoat it. We're at a crossroads. We've seen some resistance from certain stakeholders and investors who are questioning our shift into renewable energy. They want more immediate returns, and they're not willing to wait for the long-term growth we're pursuing." One of the board members, an older man with graying hair, interrupted her. "Sarah, with all due respect, we've made it clear that we need to consider profitability. These investments in renewable energy, while commendable, are expensive. We're risking a lot by betting on the future." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she addressed him directly. "What we're risking is the future of this company. If we don't diversify and innovate now, we'll become irrelevant. I won't let that happen. I will fight for the future of Turner Enterprises, and I will not back down. If anyone in this room doesn't share that vision, now is the time to speak up." The room fell into silence. One by one, the board members exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them spoke up. Sarah knew that some of them had doubts, but she also knew that change was inevitable. She was willing to take the risks, and it seemed that her resolve was finally being respected. Mr. Turner's absence was felt more deeply than Sarah had anticipated. His usual presence in the room had always carried weight, but now, with Sarah leading, the board was beginning to realize that the company's future was in her hands. And she would not be swayed. The following weeks were crucial. Sarah spent every waking hour pushing her initiatives forward, meeting with potential investors who shared her vision and ensuring that the company's renewable energy projects stayed on track. Despite the resistance from some quarters, the company's success in attracting new partners in clean tech gave her the leverage she needed to fight back against the pressure. As Sarah sat in her office late one evening, the city lights shimmering outside her window, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. From the woman fired for being late to this moment, where she was not just leading Turner Enterprises, but reimagining its future. She had faced down obstacles, both external and internal, and had proven that her vision was the right one. She wasn't done yet. She still had battles to fight, but this time, she had the strength and the support to win. The company's shift into renewable energy was gaining momentum, and Sarah's leadership was being tested in new ways. As the months passed, Turner Enterprises was starting to make its mark in the industry, but Sarah knew that true success wasn't just about landing major deals. It was about reshaping the culture from the inside out. Her vision for the company wasn't just about innovation in products and services, it was about breaking down the old guard mentality that had once stifled progress. Despite her growing success, there was a tension that lingered within the company. Some of the old executives, those who had long been loyal to Mr. Turner's way of thinking, had begun to grow restless. They hadn't agreed with Sarah's aggressive push for change, and they weren't ready to embrace the company's new direction. One afternoon, Sarah sat in her office reviewing progress reports when Claire entered, a concerned look on her face. "Sarah, there's something you should know. Some of the older executives, well, they're starting to get vocal about their dissatisfaction with how things are being handled. A few of them want to have a meeting with you about the future direction of Turner Enterprises." Sarah set the report aside, her expression hardened. She had known the day would come when the resistance would become more overt. The company had changed, and not everyone was willing to change with it. "I'll meet with them," Sarah said, her voice calm, but there was an undercurrent of determination. "Set it up." The next day, Sarah sat in a high-stakes meeting with 3 of the senior executives. Each of them was a holdover from the old days, men and women who had worked closely with Mr. Turner for years. They were used to doing things a certain way, and they weren't thrilled with the changes Sarah had made. She could tell they were uncomfortable, their body language defensive as they sat across from her. "Sarah, we've been thinking," began Margaret, the head of marketing and one of the longest-serving members of the board. "You've made significant strides, yes, but we believe that you're pushing too fast with these new initiatives. The renewable energy projects, well, they're taking up a lot of resources. We're concerned about the company's stability." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her hands folded calmly in front of her. "I understand your concerns, Margaret," she replied, her tone steady. "But this is the future. If we don't invest in these projects now, we risk being left behind. We can't afford to keep doing things the same way just because it's comfortable." One of the other executives, Greg, chimed in, his voice laced with skepticism. "You're asking us to bet the company on something that's not a guaranteed return. Renewable energy is volatile. It's risky. And frankly, I don't think we're ready for that kind of upheaval." Sarah's gaze shifted between the three of them, assessing their reactions. They were clinging to the safety net of the company's past. They weren't ready for the risk that came with growth and innovation. But Sarah knew there was no other option. "I'm not asking for a guarantee, Greg. I'm asking for your trust. Trust in the vision that's going to define this company's future. If we don't move forward, we'll be irrelevant in a few years." Margaret crossed her arms, clearly not satisfied with Sarah's response. "You're asking us to let go of the past, of what made Turner Enterprises great in the first place?" Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I'm not letting go of the past. I'm building on it. But we can't remain stagnant just because we're afraid of what's next. We have to evolve." The room fell silent, and Sarah could feel the tension between her and the senior executives. They were used to being in control, to being the ones who held the power. But they were also stuck in old ways, and it was up to Sarah to break them free of that mindset. "I know this is difficult," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "But these projects, this shift into renewable energy, this is the future of Turner Enterprises. I need you to trust me, not just as your CEO, but as someone who is invested in making sure this company doesn't just survive, but thrives." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Sarah could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was beginning to understand. The others, too, seemed to be processing what she was saying. "Fine," Margaret said after a long pause, her tone softer. "But we want to see more detailed projections. We want to make sure this transition isn't going to put the company at risk. We'll need to be involved in the planning process from here on out." "Of course," Sarah replied, her tone firm but collaborative. "I'll make sure you're all fully involved in the planning stages. But I will not slow down. This is the direction we're moving in." The executives exchanged glances, and for the first time in the meeting, Sarah could see a shift. They weren't agreeing with everything, but they were beginning to understand that this was the way forward. In the weeks that followed, Sarah worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. She made sure to meet with the executives regularly, providing them with the detailed projections they had requested and reassuring them that the company would not be jeopardized by the changes. Slowly but surely, the resistance began to wane. The executives who had once been opposed to the renewable energy projects began to see the long-term potential, and they started to support Sarah's vision. But even as the internal opposition faded, Sarah knew that the real test was still to come. The market was competitive, and the renewable energy sector was still filled with uncertainty. There would be setbacks, and not everyone outside of Turner Enterprises would be on her side. One morning, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was a major competitor in the renewable energy sector, someone she had tried to negotiate with in the past. The company was looking to make a large acquisition, and they had identified Turner Enterprises as a potential partner. "Sarah," the voice on the other end said, "we've been watching what you've been doing. We're impressed. Turner Enterprises is doing something different, and we want to discuss the possibility of a strategic merger." A merger? Sarah had considered this possibility before, but she had always been focused on Turner's independence. Now, it seemed that the company's innovation was attracting attention from larger players who saw value in what she had built. "We're interested, but we need to know that we're still going to maintain our autonomy," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I won't give up our vision just for the sake of a deal." The response was quick. "That's what we want too." We see the potential in Turner, and we want to make sure that your leadership stays at the forefront of this transition. One afternoon, Sarah sat in her office reviewing progress reports when Claire entered, a concerned look on her face. "Sarah, there's something you should know. Some of the older executives, well, they're starting to get vocal about their dissatisfaction with how things are being handled. A few of them want to have a meeting with you about the future direction of Turner Enterprises." Sarah set the report aside, her expression hardened. She had known the day would come when the resistance would become more overt. The company had changed, and not everyone was willing to change with it. "I'll meet with them," Sarah said, her voice calm, but there was an undercurrent of determination. "Set it up." The next day, Sarah sat in a high-stakes meeting with 3 of the senior executives. Each of them was a holdover from the old days, men and women who had worked closely with Mr. Turner for years. They were used to doing things a certain way, and they weren't thrilled with the changes Sarah had made. She could tell they were uncomfortable, their body language defensive as they sat across from her. "Sarah, we've been thinking," began Margaret, the head of marketing and one of the longest-serving members of the board. "You've made significant strides, yes, but we believe that you're pushing too fast with these new initiatives. The renewable energy projects, well, they're taking up a lot of resources. We're concerned about the company's stability." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her hands folded calmly in front of her. "I understand your concerns, Margaret," she replied, her tone steady. "But this is the future. If we don't invest in these projects now, we risk being left behind. We can't afford to keep doing things the same way just because it's comfortable." One of the other executives, Greg, chimed in, his voice laced with skepticism. "You're asking us to bet the company on something that's not a guaranteed return. Renewable energy is volatile. It's risky. And frankly, I don't think we're ready for that kind of upheaval." Sarah's gaze shifted between the 3 of them, assessing their reactions. They were clinging to the safety net of the company's past. They weren't ready for the risk that came with growth and innovation. But Sarah knew there was no other option. "I'm not asking for a guarantee, Greg. I'm asking for your trust. Trust in the vision that's going to define this company's future. If we don't move forward, we'll be irrelevant in a few years." Margaret crossed her arms, clearly not satisfied with Sarah's response. "You're asking us to let go of the past, of what made Turner Enterprises great in the first place?" Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I'm not letting go of the past. I'm building on it. But we can't remain stagnant just because we're afraid of what's next. We have to evolve." The room fell silent, and Sarah could feel the tension between her and the senior executives. They were used to being in control, to being the ones who held the power. But they were also stuck in old ways, and it was up to Sarah to break them free of that mindset. "I know this is difficult," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "But these projects, this shift into renewable energy, this is the future of Turner Enterprises. I need you to trust me, not just as your CEO, but as someone who is invested in making sure this company doesn't just survive, but thrives." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Sarah could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was beginning to understand. The others, too, seemed to be processing what she was saying. "Fine," Margaret said after a long pause, her tone softer. "But we want to see more detailed projections. We want to make sure this transition isn't going to put the company at risk. We'll need to be involved in the planning process from here on out." "Of course," Sarah replied, her tone firm but collaborative. "I'll make sure you're all fully involved in the planning stages. But I will not slow down. This is the direction we're moving in." The executives exchanged glances, and for the first time in the meeting, Sarah could see a shift. They weren't agreeing with everything, but they were beginning to understand that this was the way forward. In the weeks that followed, Sarah worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. She made sure to meet with the executives regularly, providing them with the detailed projections they had requested and reassuring them that the company would not be jeopardized by the changes. Slowly but surely, the resistance began to wane. The executives who had once been opposed to the renewable energy projects began to see the long-term potential, and they started to support Sarah's vision. But even as the internal opposition faded, Sarah knew that the real test was still to come. The market was competitive, and the renewable energy sector was still filled with uncertainty. There would be setbacks, and not everyone outside of Turner Enterprises would be on her side. One morning, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was a major competitor in the renewable energy sector, someone she had tried to negotiate with in the past. The company was looking to make a large acquisition, and they had identified Turner Enterprises as a potential partner. Sarah, the voice on the other end said, "We've been watching what you've been doing. We're impressed. Turner Enterprises is doing something different, and we want to discuss the possibility of a strategic merger." A merger? Sarah had considered this possibility before, but she had always been focused on Turner's independence. Now, it seemed that the company's innovation was attracting attention from larger players who saw value in what she had built. "We're interested, but we need to know that we're still going to maintain our autonomy," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I won't give up our vision just for the sake of a deal." The response was quick. "That's what we want too. We see the potential in Turner, and we want to make sure that your leadership stays at the forefront of this transition." The offer was tempting, but Sarah knew that merging could also bring its own challenges, compromises, and potential loss of control. She would need to carefully weigh the benefits and risks of such a move. But as she hung up the phone, she realized that this was just another step in the evolution of Turner Enterprises, a step she would need to take with careful consideration. As the weeks passed, Sarah continued to forge ahead with her leadership, her decisions taking Turner Enterprises further into the future. The company was expanding, the projects were progressing, and the resistance she once faced was now a distant memory. She was leading not just through the projects she championed, but through the culture she had created, one that valued innovation, resilience, and boldness. Sarah wasn't just a CEO anymore. She was the face of Turner Enterprises' future. And she would fight every step of the way to make sure it was a future worth building.